So, as I've been doing my documentary, I have learned a lot about the depth of the Hawaiian Kingdom history, the Republic of Hawaii history, and then the annexation part of the USA history of Hawaii. It is very deep, very rich, and very conflicted on very many sides of the issue. The two main, I would say, scholars on this, although I kind of question David Sai's scholarship. Now, he has a PhD, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. But Kenneth Conklin, PhD, and Keanu Sai, PhD, these two have kind of went back and forth over the years. About the year 2010 through 2011, when Kenneth Conklin was a contributor to the Hawaii Reporter, I believe. I think that's the Hawaii Reporter newspaper. So there was a lot of exchanges back and forth between them in these publications. And at this point, it had been about 10 years since Keanu Sai had been convicted of a felony for theft in using this knowledge that he has about the history of Hawaii. And so this is what I wanted to talk about. There's a recent study by academics to study the acceptance of what they call grievance studies. So these people, there's three academics, and I'm going to play you the video here at the end, who would write very broken papers on grievances, whether it be race, sexuality, or gender. And they found that if you write a convincing article, regardless of the facts, regardless of the research, but if you write some sort of convincing article to say that somebody is oppressed or somebody is privileged, and it can be the most absurd thing, like tying white kids to the floor and observing their reaction based on their privilege and things like that. Just very bizarre studies that they submitted, and they got published. I think they got around a dozen of these so-called grievance studies published in very well-respected academic journals. And so that brings me to, how did Dr. David Sai, or Keanu Sai, get his PhD? And out of all of the presentations that I've watched and all of the different publications that he's printed or had published, he is so exclusive on his history, he cherry picks. So it's very intellectually dishonest. And it really comes down to the Morgan Report and the Blount Report. And if you read the Apology Resolution of 1993, you'll see that, that resolution mentioned both the Blount Report and the Morgan Report. And what is significant about that is that the Blount Report, it was to, verify the overthrow and the participation of the U.S. in the overthrow and what really happened. And so was the Morgan Report. But the Blount Report was first, and he went over with bias. He had been a known white supremacist, James Henderson Blount. You can look him up. There's a lot of books about him, a lot of history about this guy. He was a spokesman for white supremacy. And his premise for not wanting annexation of Hawaii was that he did not want to introduce a non-white element into the American population. So he didn't want Hawaii because of his racist reasons. So he goes over, he interviews people in secret. Mostly he interviews royalists. He didn't interview a lot of others. And he doesn't take sworn oaths, and he doesn't have the witnesses cross-examined in Congress. It's just a like hearsay type of thing, like, oh, well, this person said this. Well, was there any, sworn oath? Was there any affidavit or any legal documents to confirm this, or any other witnesses besides yourself? And James Blount was like, no, but these are what these people told me. This is what happened. And he brought it back to Grover Cleveland, who was a friend of Liliuokalani, the queen that was overthrown. And so Grover Cleveland was like, oh, well, this is an act of war. We got to restore the kingdom. And he heard about some of the characteristics of the Blount Report and realized that this was an incomplete report. So later, John Tyler Morgan was sent out, And John Tyler Morgan did a more thorough investigation. He did all of his interviews in the open. There wasn't secret, clandestine little meetings. Everybody had to swear an oath. And when you swear an oath to your testimony, that means that if you get found guilty of lying, or if you're found to be lying, you'll be guilty of perjury, which could carry a felony conviction and a sentence to prison. So people were bound to an oath, and if they lied, they had consequences under the Morgan Report. And so he did sworn affidavits, he did sworn testimonies, and had witnesses and notaries and everything. Did everything by the books. There wasn't any clandestine operation like with Blount. And then a lot of the witnesses, not all of them, were taken to D.C. They were flown out, or brought out to D.C. I guess at the time they wouldn't have been flown, but they were brought out to D.C. Washington, D.C. to be cross-examined by Congress. So both sides of Congress, multiple senators and congressmen on both sides of the aisle, both Republican and Democrat, cross-examined their testimony and got a real good feel of what was going on, and seeing if there was any contradictions, see if there was any incorrect plot line in the story. And so, that's pretty standard stuff. This was considered a war crime, apparently, by Grover Cleveland. That, he thought that the Marines that landed in Honolulu were there, attacking people or something. When everything came out in the open, it was found that they were just there as peacekeepers. They already had an agreement with the Kingdom of Hawaii. The United States had an agreement to have ships in Pearl Harbor. And then Minister John Stevens was told, hey, there's going to be an uprising. Can you protect the American citizens that might get killed or robbed in this big uprising? And so they came over as peacekeepers, similar to like how the UN would come over. And this is what was exposed in the Morgan Report. And then during cross-examination and in the sworn testimonies, the same witnesses that James Blount had interviewed had testified and sworn an oath that James Blount lied or misrepresented their testimonies. So in the Morgan Report, people sworn, to an oath to tell the truth, and then, gave the truth that as they knew it, swore that what James Blount wrote in, characterizing their testimony was a lie. It wasn't truth. And so everything about the Blount Report fell apart, and Grover Cleveland backed off. He was going to restore the monarchy, and then he backed off. He's like, nope, we can't do that. That's, if what the Morgan Report is saying is true, and it seems to be, then the United States wasn't involved in the overthrow, and therefore I have no obligation to restore anything. And so he didn't. He backed off. And so when David Sai and Williamson Chang and others will report on the events in history, there's three things really that they leave out. First of all, they leave out the Republic of Hawaii. They try to not mention that. Sometimes they do, kind of dismissively, but most of the time they don't even mention it in their presentations. They don't also mention the letters of recognition from all of the treaty partners of the Hawaiian Kingdom that gave a recognition to the Republic of Hawaii as a true and legitimate successor of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And then the last thing that they don't mention is the Morgan Report. They will mention the Blount Report, which is strange because Blount was a fervent racist, a spokesman for white supremacy. They use this guy's report, this white supremacist, this racial separatist, his report, James Blount's report, but they will not mention the Morgan Report. I've never heard David Sai mention it, not even once. I think I heard Williamson Chang mention it dismissively once, but I could be wrong. It could have been somebody else that I heard. I've heard probably 50 hours of these presentations by these separatists or these sovereignty people. And, so the point of it is that how did they get their PhD? If they're so intellectually dishonest that they will fail to even mention those three very important aspects of history. And those are very important aspects. And, to give both sides is intellectually honest. To neglect those three aspects is intellectually dishonest. So how did they get their PhDs if their PhDs was about these subjects. And so here's why. It's about grievance studies. And there's a whole new liberal narrative, an anti-patriarchy narrative, and mostly anti-Caucasian narrative in schools today. And it was proven, it was solidified in these grievance studies that were fake. They were just fake studies that they submitted to these well-respected peer-reviewed journals. And then those peer-reviewed journals accepted them, and published them. It's crazy. They were just fake. They were totally fake studies. There was no truth to them whatsoever, and they were bizarre. But because they identified privilege or racism or some sort of oppression, then automatically they were accepted. And that's what these grievance studies proved. And that's what I'm saying is that the difference between David Sai and Ken Conklin is Ken Conklin didn't use his knowledge and his background. He's a PhD, has a couple master's degrees. He studied Hawaiian history, and he even taught at University of Hawaii, Manoa, Hawaiian studies classes. If I can get down to that, his credentials are here. So these are his teaching credentials, his education and academic credentials, and then this is where he taught a 12-hour short course on Hawaiian sovereignty at University of Hawaii, Manoa, fall of 2002. So the difference between these two is they have similar backgrounds. They both have PhDs. They both taught at University of Hawaii, Hawaiian Studies. They both have written books about Hawaiian history. They're both qualified, academics in this study. But the difference is that David Sai used his knowledge to create something called Perfect Title, a company that was to help rescue default mortgages, and he was using this knowledge to say, well, your title's incorrect because the Hawaiian kingdom still exists. And so he's charging Native Hawaiians who were upside down in their mortgage $1,500 and giving them nothing in return, except for one time he gave somebody a fake title. They tried to reclaim their house with this fake title and kick out the current occupants that owned the house, and use the title as proof that David Sai had created illegitimately. And so they that's what they got out of it, as well as a prison sentence, or a conviction anyway. David Sai and them, the people he was helping, both got charged with theft, and I think they all three got felonies. That was in 1999. So David Sai is using his knowledge and his academics for evil. I mean, he's ripping people off. He's charging hundreds of Native Hawaiians thousands of dollars each. Over $1,500. One of them he charged $8,000, and that's why he's got a new charge as of June 2019. Let me see if I can show you that. Yeah, this is state alleges Hawaiian scholar with trouble past bilk distressed homeowners, and this is about David Sai, and it talks about his first arrest in '99, his first felony, and now he's being investigated again for another felony. He's using his for bilking Native Hawaiians out of their money, promising to help them get out of their defaulted mortgage, and get a title for free. Kenneth Conklin is just there to educate people. He testified at the Akaka hearings for the Akaka bill and others, other legal hearings about Hawaiian history and sovereignty and things like that. He's not ripping anybody off. So there's a big difference here. Now they do a lot of smear on Ken Conklin. He's a racist. He's he's a cannibal, one of them said. All kinds of silly things they've said about Ken Conklin. None of it's true. But what is proven is that David Sai is certainly ripping people off. He's taking money from Native Hawaiians and giving them nothing in return, except sometimes felonies. So grievance studies, if you just do a Google search for grievance studies, you'll see a lot of this. But I'm going to play this right now so you can learn more about it.
Okay. Is the light okay in here? Yeah. I just read my email. We have our first win. The dog park paper has been accepted. They don't know. We're about to tell them.
Gotta read you something. Dear Dr. Helen Wilson, I have now closely considered the revisions of your manuscript, Dog Park, and will recommend its publication in Gender, Place, and Culture. You have done very good work to address the issues reviewers raised and have clarified your arguments. Thank you for your contribution to gender, place, and culture, and I hope to be seeing your manuscript in print. Yours truly, PhD, Managing Editor, Gender, Place, and Culture. We have an accepted paper in the #1 feminist geography journal.
Since approximately June of 2017, I, along with two other concerned academics, Peter Bogosian and Helen Pluckrose, have been writing intentionally broken academic papers and submitting them to highly respected journals in fields that study gender, race, sexuality, and similar topics. We did this to expose a political corruption that's taken hold of the university. By this point, several of these papers have been accepted in highly respected journals, and one that claims that dog humping incidents can be taken as evidence of rape culture has been officially honored as excellent scholarship. I'm not going to lie to you, we had a lot of fun with this project.
The reviewers are worried that we didn't respect the dog's privacy.
That's the concern.
We respected the channel.
But don't let that lead you to believe that we're not addressing a serious problem. If you have a few minutes, I'll try to explain. To be clear up front, we think studying topics like gender, race, and sexuality is worthwhile, and getting it right is extremely important. The problem is how these topics are being studied right now. A culture has developed in which only certain conclusions are allowed, like those that make whiteness and masculinity problematic. The fields we're concerned about put social grievances ahead of objective truth. So as a simple summary, we call the problem Grievance Studies. To test the depth of this problem, my collaborators and I dedicated ourselves to a 1 to 2 year secret project targeting top Grievance Studies journals with an agreement to publicly release our findings, no matter what the outcome. We started officially on August 16, 2017, and by Thanksgiving we were in trouble. We had begun ambitiously and mostly stupidly. Our first papers were really only suited to test the hypothesis that we could penetrate their leading journals with poorly researched hoax papers. That wasn't the case, and we were wrong for thinking we might be able to. So by late November, it looked like all we'd accomplished was ruining our reputations.
If this doesn't achieve anything, it would actually frighten me.
We needed to change our approach, so we walked back from the hoaxing and began to engage with the existing scholarship in these fields more deeply. This led us to learn a lot more about the inner workings of grievance studies.
The best I can tap into is that there's this kind of like religious architecture in their mind where privilege is sin, privilege is evil, and they've identified education as the place where it has to be fixed. So you can come up with these really nasty arguments like, let's put white kids in chains on the floor at school as an educational opportunity. And if you frame it in terms of overcoming privilege, and then you frame their resistance, that they won't want this to happen to them, that they would complain about this. If you frame that in terms of, oh, they only complain about that because they're privileged and they can't handle it because their privilege made them weak, then it's right in.
Papers started getting in.
You've got to be me that this happened!
By March, with 2 papers accepted and 1 published, it would be fair to say that we had become accepted grievance scholars. By June, it was 3, with 1 having been officially honored by the journal as excellent scholarship. By July, it was 5. By August, 7. This shouldn't have been possible. So far, what we're learning is rather astonishing, but the data we've gathered require more analysis to fully comprehend. What appears beyond dispute is that making absurd and horrible ideas sufficiently politically fashionable can get them validated at the highest levels of academic grievance studies.
We rewrote a section of Mein Kampf as intersectional feminism, and this journal has accepted it. Social work.
This is deeply concerning, because the work of grievance scholars goes on to be taught in classes, to design educational curricula, to be taken up by activists, to influence how media is produced, and to misinform journalists and politicians about the true nature of our cultural realities. No one tolerates this sort of corruption when they find out an industry is funding biased research to make itself look a certain way. The same scrutiny should apply to research when it pushes a political agenda. And we have uncovered enough evidence to suggest that this corruption is pervasive among many disciplines, including women's and gender studies, feminist studies, race studies, sexuality studies, fat studies, queer studies, cultural studies, and sociology. You may be thinking that the work done in these fields must be good, because it seems to continue the noble work of the civil rights movement. Well, after having spent a year immersed in it and becoming recognized as experts in it, we have to disagree. Grievance Studies does not continue the work of the civil rights movements. It corrupts it, and it trades upon their good names to keep pushing a kind of social snake oil onto a public that keeps getting sicker. Progress is easier without Grievance Studies. My collaborators and I are left-wing academics who can now say with confidence, these people don't speak for us. This is now a plea to all the progressives and minority groups these people claim to speak for. We suggest you spend some time critically engaging with the ideas coming out of these fields and decide for yourself whether they speak for you.